Today we're going to show you how to change the drive motor on your washer, and it's a really easy job. All we're going to need is a number 2 Phillips screwdriver, a flat blade screwdriver, and a 5/16 nut driver. Let me show you how we do it. Now to do this repair we will need to disconnect the power to the washer, so simply pull the plug on it. Now in the portable versions such as this one, it's a matter of removing the console to allow us to lift the whole cabinet off of the washer, and then we can gain access to the motor. On stack models of this, you would need to take the main top off, which is held in place by a couple of 5/16 screws at the very back. Once you've taken the top off of that model, you can then reach inside, disconnect the 2 screws that secure the front panel, and do the repair through the front. Now in this model, there are 2 Phillips screws holding that console to the cabinet. So we simply remove those, and then we can just lift up on that console and rotate it backwards, and it will hinge just over the back panel and hold itself in place. And then disconnect the harness to the lid switch. And then using a flat blade screwdriver, we're going to remove these 2 clips that hold the back panel to the cabinet. So we'll just go down into the front slot on those, pry back, release the tension on that spring clip, and then remove it. Do the same on the opposite side. Now if we lift up on that cabinet, that back panel will just tilt back a little bit, but it will hold itself in place. So just tilt forward on the cabinet, around in front of it, and grasp it with one hand. Now next we're going to tilt that cabinet forward and lift it off of the base. The back panel will stay in position. Now the cabinet sits on 2 little tabs on the front of that base frame, so you may need to lift up just gently on that to release it, and then we can pull the cabinet and set it aside. Now with the cabinet off, we have access to the pump and motor assembly. The pump is held onto that motor shaft with these 2 spring clips. Now you can either remove the hoses from that pump and then pull the pump off, but there's also enough room to just remove the 2 clips and lift the pump off with the hoses still attached, and that way we don't have to worry about any water spill. So with a flat blade screwdriver, just gently go in underneath those clips, release them, and they'll fit into a slot on the front of that motor with just a 1/4 turn. So if they come out, it's all right, we can put them back in. We can now pull straight forward on that pump and slide that off the motor shaft, and then we can tuck it out of the way without any fear of getting water on the floor. All right, with the pump out of the way, we can next disconnect the harness to the motor by simply depressing that locking tab, and then just wiggle that back and forth until it pulls out, and tuck that out of the way. And once we get that motor a little further, we'll also need to take the start capacitor off the side of that motor. But our next step will be to remove 2 screws that secure those clamps in place. And they may already have been removed because they're merely there for shipping purposes. So using either a Phillips screwdriver or a 5/16 nut driver, we'll remove those 2 screws, and then with our flat blade, we'll just go in under the edge of that clip, pry those free. Now we can just slide that motor. We can next just slide that motor forward, and that will release it from the drive coupling at the back. And we're just going to tilt that out far enough that we can access this 5/16 screw that holds the capacitor to the side of the motor frame. So just remove the screw and set that capacitor aside. At this point, we can pull that motor right out through the front. And on the rear of the motor, there will be some rubber mounts, and they may have stayed with the motor, or they may have stayed with the mounting bracket inside the washer. But if they're on the motor, we'll remove those and install them on the new motor. And the drive coupling may have stayed attached to the motor, and we'll need to remove that as well. So simply just pry that off the shaft. And we'll also inspect that coupling to make sure that it's in good shape. It's composed of 3 pieces, 2 pieces identical to this, and then a rubber coupling in the middle. Make sure that those are in good shape, and if not, replace that at the same time. We can now discard the motor, and we can install that coupling on the new motor. Make sure it's fully inserted onto that shaft. Just gently tap it into place until it's flush with the end of the motor shaft. Now our next step will be to tap that hole where the mount for the capacitor is going to go. So we'll just take the screw and thread that into the hole so we can cut some threads in it. And that will make mounting it a lot easier if we've already got the threads cut into it. And then we'll install the rubber bushings on those 4 pegs in the back of the motor, the narrow end pointing away. Now you may need to have somebody hold that pump out of the way or just tie it back with something. Now with the rubber mounting bushings on the motor, our next step will be to install that capacitor. And it's easier if we just pull the 2 wires off of the capacitor and then mount it to the motor where there's a little more room, and make sure that we have the terminal end of that capacitor facing the connection for the motor harness. And tighten that screw securely. Now next we're going to position that motor up against the back plate and this coupling. So just take note the position of that coupling. We'll pick the 3 empty slots are where the motor coupler will fit into there. So we'll want to make sure that we orientate that coupling to line up with it. And then we'll push it back into position. Now if you've removed either or both of the spring mounting clamps for that motor, just take note of where they will be positioned. They're going to slide into that opening and then rotate and lock in place. Now it's easier to put that motor in with the top one removed. So we'll line up that motor coupling, slide the motor back in. If need be, you can rotate the motor shaft to help line up that coupling. And it should seat firmly up against that motor mounting bracket at the back. Now at this point, we can take the retaining clamp and insert that into that slot at the back of the motor mounting bracket, rotate it into the flat position, and then snap it down into the opening. Do the same with the bottom one. And that should hold that motor firmly in place. Next, we can reinstall the 2 wires that go to that capacitor, and then attach the motor harness connector, making sure that the locking tab engages that hook. Now you can reinstall the 2 screws that hold those clamps in place, but it's not necessary. They will stay there without them. Then next we'll get the pump ready to reinstall. I suggest you hook the bottom clamp in first. So then we're going to pull that motor into position. And again, we'll take note that the motor shaft has to line up with the opening on the back of the pump. There's 2 flat-sided pulley in that pump, so you may need to rotate the motor shaft enough to line up with it. Now once we have that shaft lined up properly with the pump, we're going to push that pump on, and the 4 legs of that pump will set in these recessed areas on the motor, and that way we'll know that it's fully inserted onto the motor shaft. You can then snap the clamp into position. We'll install the top one into the motor. And clamp it in place. And we're now ready to put the cabinet back on. Now, when reinstalling the cabinet on this style of washer, we have a couple of tabs on the base frame, one on either side at the front and another one on either side at the rear, that will line up with a slotted opening in the bottom of the cabinet. And as well, there's a projected lip on the front of that cabinet that will slide below this cross piece on the base frame. Now, the best method I've found for putting that cabinet on is to tilt it back towards you a bit, raise the lid, and you can actually look down inside and view that lip going underneath there, as well as mating up the two tabs with the slots on the cabinet. We can carefully lower it into position, and we may need to come around to either side to ensure that the plastic spacer between that back panel and the edge of the cabinet slides into position. And check both sides. And if you have any question on whether it's firmly attached, just pull it on the cabinet at the back, and that will tell you whether we've engaged that tab or not. When it's properly engaged, you won't be able to pull that cabinet away. Now that we've ensured that the cabinet is attached in both rear corners, we can reconnect the wire harness to the lid switch, make sure that the locking tab engages. Then we'll reinstall the two clips that hold the cabinet to the back panel. So there's a short, straight edge at the back of that will hook into a slotted opening on that back panel. And then you should be able to just push down with the palm of your hand until it locks in place. Do the same on the opposite side. Then pivot the console up over the back panel. And then reinstall the two Phillips screws. Secure that in place. We're now ready to reconnect the power, and our repair is complete.